Afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for attending the March installment of the iMapInvasives monthly webinar series, where today we will be talking about the topic of identifying characteristics and how to take a good photograph for your iMapInvasive records. So my name is Douglas Knopf. I am the Invasive Species Project Specialist for the New York Natural Heritage Program. I'm also joined by Mitchell O'Neill, the Invasive Species Biologist for the Natural Heritage Program as well. He's going to be monitoring the chat box throughout the presentation. A few housekeeping things before we get started. The meeting is being recorded. Everybody who registers or attends today's meeting will receive an email in the coming days that has a link to the recording of the webinar, which will be posted to our YouTube channel. The email will also include any other resources or links that we mentioned during today's presentation. Everybody's microphone is muted for the duration of the presentation. If anybody has any questions that come up during anything that we're going over today, you can go ahead and put those questions into the chat box. If Mitch can get to them, he will answer during the presentation. And if not, hopefully we'll have a little bit of time at the end to go over any additional questions that people may have. And as always, if people have questions after the webinar concludes, you can always reach out to us directly, and we'll have an email address at the end for people to reach out with. And the agenda for today's presentation, we'll go over a brief overview of what iMapInvasives is and how we operate. And then we'll go through identifying characteristics for terrestrial plants, aquatic plants, and various animals, aquatic and terrestrial. For the most part, this is going to be focused on terrestrial plants, as this is what most people are often surveying for. And tips related to aquatic plants and animal species are going to be more general. This is not meant to be an all-inclusive species ID training. This is going to be kind of brief and more all-encompassing, just trying to show examples of certain features of invasive species that are common in New York State. And we will talk about places where you can get more specific invasive species identification resources at the end as well. So starting off, the New York Natural Heritage Program is the organization that we work with. This is the organization that acts as the data collectors and record keepers for all of New York State's rare, threatened, and endangered species and ecosystem type information. And as one of the greatest threats to rare species in New York is the spread and establishment of invasive species, New York State also established the official invasive species database program under New York Natural Heritage Program. So iMapInvasives is the database software that we use to host this database program, where we have our publicly accessible invasive species database. We also host a number of different specialized data collection tools and programs, like our Watercraft Inspection Stewardship Program, or WISPA. And we also take all the data that goes into iMapInvasives to run various analyses and prioritization models to help the various professionals and agencies in New York State better prioritize their work. iMapInvasives also has several other functions usable by its various user groups, such as species distribution modeling, automatic generated reports, early detection alerts if you want to know when certain species are coming into certain areas within the state, web map services for hosting live view of the iMapInvasives environment on your own website, and tracking control efforts and results. So on top of having information on presence records, you can also have not detected records and treatment records within our database. And in New York, we really pride ourselves on having a well-curated database where a lot of the data coming in is highly accurate. And the way we do that is by having a system of confirmed versus unconfirmed data. So for data to come into iMap and show up on the live map, it has to be confirmed in some fashion. For a lot of our partner agencies, professionals like the DEC or parks, this is coming in, data is being collected by professionals who are well-trained in invasive species identification. But for people who are, in volunteer organizations or just community scientists who are collecting data on their smartphones, we have a system of bringing all of that data in as unconfirmed. So this is a view of the confirmed data map once it has been reviewed by an expert or collected by an expert. It shows up on the public map. Anybody is able to see it, click on different points and see information about it. But for information that is unconfirmed, it shows up on a separate layer. This is data that has not yet been confirmed to be accurate by either a professional or somebody who is well-versed in invasive species identification. So if we were to go to one of these records specifically and look at it, it looks very similar to any other record. It's just in a different unconfirmed state. So most people on the iMapInvasives team have the ability to go through and confirm these records. And the things that we're looking for is basically to confirm that all of the information within these records is correct. So we're looking at things like the date, the location, if it's a terrestrial plant, making sure it shows up in a location where a terrestrial plant could. It's not in the middle of the ocean, or sometimes people will mix up latitude and longitude and you'll have something pop up in the middle of Antarctica. So we go through and make sure everything makes sense. And the single most important thing that we look at is the photograph that is attached to these records. So if somebody is saying, I found Japanese stiltgrass, obviously we have to look at it and say, yes, this is Japanese stiltgrass. And there are certain things that make a photo a good photo and makes a record easily confirmable. So taking a closer look at this record here, if we zoom in on the photo that they provide with it, we can ask ourselves the question of what actually makes a photograph good and what makes a record confirmable. So there are several things that you can take into account when taking photos for these records. Simple, general advice for, taking a photo of anything, making sure that whatever you're photographing is in the center of your photo, the main focal point. It's in focus. If you're taking a picture of something directly in front of you, that's like something thin, like a plant. Oftentimes your camera can kind of focus on the background instead, and the thing in the foreground becomes blurry and you can't really see it. Your photo should be close up, and whenever possible, it should be of an individual. So a lot of times if there's an invasive species where there's 100 or 1,000 or a full acre of stiltgrass or something like that, it's always better to take a single instance of that plant or whatever it is you're photographing and taking a picture of just that instead of trying to encompass the entire population in it, so that we can actually see the details of a single individual. And then lighting is also important. This goes both ways. If it's very dark, it's difficult to see certain features. And then if it's, a super sunny day, the photo can be overexposed and some of the details get washed out in that case as well. General tips for trying to make all of these things possible, using things to kind of force the focus of whatever's in the foreground. If you're trying to photograph a thin branch or plant and it's focusing on the background, you can do something like put your hand behind the plant, use a notebook or a sheet of paper to kind of force the focus of your camera onto what it is you're trying to photograph. If it's in a super dark area, you can use a flashlight, or you can take a small sample of whatever it is you're trying to photograph and bring it into a more well-lit area. If you have an invasive shrub that you're trying to photograph, you can lop a branch off, bring it to a better lighting environment, take a picture of it there, because at the end of the day, the picture is used to confirm the species identification. It doesn't really necessarily need to paint the perfect picture of what is happening at the site. It's just for species ID. So you're able to do things like that. And the all-encompassing reason for all of this advice, and the reason we need this, is because we need to be able to see the identifying characteristics of whatever species it is that you are reporting. And what we say, or when we say identifying characteristics, what we mean is whatever unique feature that is visible on that species that we can use to differentiate it from all of the other possible species that it could be. A good example of this is if anybody has ever gone out into the field and tried to key out specific plants using a field guide or dichotomous key. If you are looking through the different steps that it lists out, each species, where it dead ends at the actual species, has some sort of a unique identifying feature that none of the other species within that genus or whatever have. So an example here, I have a key or snippet of a key from Linicera species or bush honeysuckles. And some of the underlying things would be considered identifying features. So some are very subtle, some are more obvious. If something is, hairy versus not hairy, if certain leaves are fused at the base versus individual leaves, that's kind of an obvious thing. whereas, something has stiff hairs compared to soft hairs might be a little more subtle, and you might want to focus on having a few identifying characteristics in order to, properly showcase that. And so before we move on from this photo on the left here, they identified it as Japanese stilt grass. So what in that photo actually makes it confirmable and identifiable? There's other grasses that have similar shape, similar size of leaf blades, things like that. But when looking at that photo, we can definitely confirm that it is Japanese stilt grass because of these silvery hairs along the midrib of each blade on that grass. So that is something that will only be present on Japanese stilt grass. All other species that look similar won't have that. So we can look at that and say, yes, this is Japanese stilt grass. We can confirm a record based on that photo. So the grander question is, what sort of features of a species, or specifically plant, could be considered unique? Well, back to the field guide example, there's tons of field guides. Everyone probably has stacks of them at their home. If you have one, you have 100 of them. And if you ever read through them, you know that every species, every feature can be used as a identifying feature for some species. There's, tons of very subtle nuances that divide certain species apart from one another. So for the sake of simplicity and the sake of time for this presentation, what we're going to do is break plants into three main groups, being grasses, woody plants, and forbs. And again, for the sake of time, everything is going to fit neatly into one of these three categories. We're going to kind of do like a rapid fire of main identifying features that you might want to photograph in species, and then give a few specific examples from invasives for each one. So starting off with grasses, this is things like Phragmites and reeds, bamboo, and various species that have the word grass in their common name. So things like reed canary grass or silvergrass, things like that. And the features that we're going to be looking at are roots, shoots, nodes, ligules, leaves, and seeds. And we'll just go through, show a few pictures of what it might look like to properly document some of these identifying features. So starting off with roots, a few species where it might be useful to take pictures of the roots. Again, Japanese stilt grass, as the name implies, stilt grass, instead of it being a single blade of grass popping up out of the ground, it tends to have these sort of leggy, branchy root systems. So if you look at kind of the bottom of this photo, you'll see there's one stem here that leads to several of these little root clusters. So it'll kind of be lifting itself up off the ground on these small root stilts, whereas other grasses will kind of be one stem coming out of the ground on its own. Bamboo species, bamboo is a type of grass, so we're lumping it in with these other ones here. Can also have certain identifying features around their roots, things like how many of their nodes are putting out roots, as well as how large the sections are close to the roots. So, how many inches there are between each of these little nodes here at the bottom portion where the roots are coming out. This can be helpful in differentiating a few species apart from one another. Shoots, again, this is mostly pertaining to bamboo species very early in the season when they first start to emerge. Looking at the shoot can help determine what species it is exactly based on the structure of leaves that are visible on the shoot. It can also help to determine whether or not it is a bamboo or if it's a similar looking species. So this is an example of there was old knotweed that somebody had cut down and it looked like bamboo. It was reported to us as a possible bamboo, and we asked them to send photos. Once it started to send up shoots, they were able to send this photo, and we can see from the structure of it and the leaves that it was actually a species of knotweed instead of a species of bamboo. So nodes, also known as knees or joints in grasses, can tell a lot about what species it is. Again, using the bamboo example, the nodes can be used for identification, whether or not they are swelled out. So you can kind of see this at the node, kind of juts out a little bit compared to the section below it, as well as the pattern of branching, either sending out little branches or leaves from those nodes can be good to photograph. And over on the right side here, we have slender false brome. And one of the key identifying characteristics for this one is the nodes of this plant are distinctly very hairy. There's a lot of hairs on just the nodes. So there's a few areas here where you can see the nodes are kind of these bright white spots as opposed to the green stems. So that helps to differentiate it from other similar looking species. This photo also shows how important lighting can be. So the entirety of the plant kind of has this hair. It's on the nodes. There's a little bit of fine hairs along the stems. And then if you can see along some of the margins of the leaf blades themselves, there's also hairs there. And that's very visible in this well-lit section on the kind of top right here, compared to the bottom left where it's in the shade and it kind of loses those fine details and it's a lot harder to see those fine hairs. So if you're trying to document things like fine hair on a plant species, making sure that it's well lit so it can kind of catch those hairs is a important feature to keep in mind. So ligules, this is a structure of grasses where the leaf is kind of jutting off of the stem. In several species, this can be used as a good identifying feature. Two species, Phragmites and reed canary grass, have these features, which are very commonly used for identification. So either one of these photos could be used. You know, if you report Phragmites and this is the only photo you include, this is good enough to confirm the species. On Phragmites, the ligule is kind of these fine, wispy haired, almost like kind of the end of a feather. And on reed canary grass, it's more of this complete entire structure, very thin, sort of like rice paper, where you can see through it a little bit, and the ends are a little bit fringed. A good way to make it so that these are very visible is to kind of peel the leaf blade away from the stem, like it is in the picture on the right here, so that the ligule is kind of freestanding. It makes it a little bit easier to photograph. So leaves, obviously, when you think of grass, you think of a blade of grass in your lawn, which is pretty much all leaf. A lot of invasive grass species have, more complex structures, but the leaves are still important and can be used for ID. A few examples here, Phragmites, those very long, stiff leaf blades. Some of these you can see if you look closely, they have a little bit of a serration to the edges of them. Chinese silvergrass. This photo is actually an example of the focus issue I had mentioned earlier. This one blade of grass that's kind of in the foreground is a little bit out of focus and blurry, while the plant behind it is a little more sharp. But we can still use this for identification. This is a good example of species that have like a very distinct midrib, so it's got that very bright white stripe, and you can tell that it's a little bit indented from the rest of the leaf blade. And then a small carpet grass over on the right side here. This is an example of a leaf that is fully clasped around the stem, so the leaf kind of continues around the backside instead of just coming off the front, as something like Phragmites would. And then also along the margin, there's a little bit of fine hairs and kind of a little bit of waviness to it, almost like a lasagna noodle, where just the margin of the leaf kind of has that wavy structure to it. So it's good to have photos of both it flat at the top, like it is in the lower left of that photo, as well as kind of a side profile in these top leaves here, where you can see that waviness. And then seeds are usually a really good and unique indicator of species for many grass species. There's a lot of variation within it. You can have kind of these feathery plumes, as in Chinese silvergrass or Phragmites. You might have a fully erect seed head, like in Timothy grass. In this example, you have the flowers are still on it, so these kind of structures that are coming off are the individual flowers. And then later in the season, this will just kind of turn into a corn dog looking seed head of individual seeds. Reed canary grass, so this one is a little less erect, kind of starts to droop over under its own weight as it matures. And these seeds are a little softer with kind of these smaller subsections coming off of the main seed head. And then all the way over here into slender falsebrome. This will be fully drooped over by the time the seeds are fully matured under their own weight. So the seed head will kind of poke up straight out of the plant and then droop over kind of at a 180-degree arc. And this will be less seeds compared to some of these other species on the left here, but the seeds will be a lot larger. They'll have these very long, distinct awns coming off of the seeds. And you can even see on a few of these here, there's a little bit of remaining structure from some of the flowers as well. So taking pictures of the seeds, really good for species identification. A little bit timing dependent. Obviously, things are only in seed for a little bit towards the end of their growing season, but if you can catch them, it's a good feature to have. So moving right along from grass species into the woody plant species. So these are things like trees and shrubs and the various species that are covered in thorns that we all love so much while we're doing management work. And for these species, the features we'll be going through are fruit, overall form, the thorns, the bark, leaves, and the flowers. So starting off with fruit, obviously there's a very wide array of colors and structures for fruit for these kinds of species, and a lot of times they can be very distinct and identifying. So a lot of these here are probably things that people recognize. The way that the fruits are growing can be a good indicator if they're in pairs like this on honeysuckle. If they're kind of in these clusters like they are in a more cork tree, distinct groupings of four like black jet bead. Color is also very distinct for some of these. Black jet bead, obviously a very dark, striking black color. Porcelain berry has a lot of variation to the color where it can be a light blue to a dark purple. And then things like oriental bittersweet where it's very striking against a brown backdrop, as these fruits will remain on the plant throughout the fall and into the winter, where they'll kind of be that sharp color contrast from the brown of the other dead plant material around them, as well as those bright fruit capsules around them, the bright yellow color. So form, obviously, if it's a tree versus a shrub, this is a good thing to photograph. But also things like if the pattern of leaves or branches is alternate versus opposite, this can be helpful in differentiating species. So over on the left here is an example of an alternate leaf species in olive, where kind of the leaves take turns coming off of which side of the branch. And then in the middle here, burning bush is an example of a species that is opposite. So every time a branch comes off of one side, there will be a matching branch on the other side, and the same thing for the leaf patterns. And then multiflora rose is kind of a more hectic species where it kind of grows in these big piles where there's a lot of stems coming out of a central cluster in the ground. And this didn't really fit into any of the other sections very neatly, so I wanted to highlight for multiflora rose that one of the best identifying characteristics is at the end of the leaves. So it has these compound leaf structures, and where these leaf meet the stem of the multiflora rose, there'll be kind of this feathery structure here, which is called a stipule. This is a very good identifying feature for multiflora rose. We don't need to see, individual thorns. We don't need to see flowers on it. If we get a picture like this, where we can see that stipule structure there at the end of the leaf, that is enough for us to confirm it. So moving on to thorns, again, multiflora rose, although you don't need the thorns, they are a distinct characteristic. They kind of have that recurve to them, almost like a cat's claw, which makes them really good at grabbing onto your clothes as you're trying to walk through them in the field. And then there's a bunch of different types of thorns, shapes, and whatnot for different species. Things like Japanese angelica tree have a stem that is completely covered in thorns, and the thorns even expand onto the leaf structure of it a little bit here. A common buckthorn will have woody thorns that are kind of on the ends of branches. So a few places on this example, you can see just past the buds, there will be a few sharp woody thorns protruding at the end of branches. And thorns can also be used to tell apart certain species that share a genus. So for common barberry versus Japanese barberry, they both can look very similar, especially in the winter when there's no fruit or leaves left on them. But a Japanese barberry will always have these clusters of a single thorn, while in common barberry, also called European barberry, they'll have these grouping of 3 to 5 thorns in a cluster. So on the top here, you can see there's 3. Further down, it looks like there might be 4 or 5 in clusters, but if there's multiple thorns, that's going to be your common barberry. Bark, obviously, if it's a woody species, it'll have bark. That on its own can be used as a distinct characteristic for several species. Something like tree of heaven that has its distinct cantaloupe skin bark, as people refer to it as. But also bark can have other unique features. So over on the top left here, burning bush, also known as winged euonymus, will have these sort of corky wings that protrude off of the bark that will kind of break if you try to pry on them with your fingers. Things like autumn olive will have a distinct bark texture on new growth. So this is like a first year twig, and it'll have kind of a silvery color to it and covered in orange speckles. That's a good distinct characteristic for this species. Those speckles also expand onto the buds, the petioles, the backs of the leaves themselves, as well as the fruit for autumn olive. And then not just the outside of bark can be distinct, but the inside of the bark as well. So for species like common buckthorn, if you have a pocket knife with you, or even if you can just kind of scrape away at some of the thin bark, or even just the lenticels on the bark, these little horizontal structures, if you can scrape that away and get to the underside of the bark, it has a very distinct bright orange color. And especially when common buckthorn is young, it can look similar to things like cherry species. So if you can scratch away the bark and see this coloration, we know that it's common buckthorn. And then for species like emmer cork tree, it can look very similar to some native tree species like ash, especially with their compound leaves. But if you are to cut into one of the branches or again remove some of that bark, it has a very distinct highlighter yellow color to the underside of the bark. Leaves, tons of different types of leaves for different species. Things to look for are things like what the margin looks like. So for common buckthorn, kind of has that sawtooth margin with the kind of light serration along the outside of it, as well as the venation structure. So for common buckthorn, again, the veins on the outside sort of curve back towards the middle, curve back towards the tip. Whereas in other species like autumn olive or honeysuckle, the leaves just sort of jut out straight to the ends of the leaves. Distinct coloration on the top versus bottom. Again, autumn olive has a sort of distinct silvery underside to the leaves. So when taking a photo like this, flipping over a couple of leaves so you can see the front and the back in the same photo is good practice. Honeysuckle here, I don't know how well it comes up on your screen, but there's very distinct little hairs on the petioles of these leaves. For several honeysuckle species, a good way to tell them apart is if there are hairs on the top of the leaves versus on the bottom of the leaves, or absence of hair. So again, having one leaf flipped over at the bottom versus one on the top is good for identification. And then if the leaves have any sort of a distinct like waxiness or shine to them, as in several of the privet species, this is also good to highlight. It's also good to show that there's a lot of variation in leaf shape, and that's not always the best thing. So for common buckthorn over here, you can see some of the leaves are almost like oval in shape, while some of them have a distinct point to them. There's a lot of species that have great variation in the way that their leaves are shaped. So just the leaves alone aren't always the best identifying feature. And then finishing off with flowers. There's many flower types as there are days in the week. There's a ton of different types of flowers. But a lot of times they are very distinct to the species that you are looking at. So if you were able to time it where you can go out and do your surveys and collect your data while certain species are in flower, this is one of the best things to include in identification. So things like multiflora rose, obviously it's implied in the name. There's multiple flowers in these single clusters instead of other rose bushes where it's a single flower coming out. Common barberry kind of has these cascading droop of multiple flowers. Honeysuckle, again, there's 8 different species that we track in iMapInvasives. They readily hybridize with one another to create, these weird unknown hybrids, but the flowers are some of the best structures for identifying species. So like for this one, some of the identifying features, you can see it's coming out from the axillary area here between the stem and the leaf. There's 2 flowers per stem. They're kind of fused at the base there. The color, the overall shape and form of it, all of these things can be used for identifying the species and separating them from other ones. So one of the best features is going to be flowers if you're able to time your surveys to when they are in flower. And then moving into the final plant category, which is forbs. otherwise known as herbaceous species. These are basically any of the plants that don't have a woody structure and aren't grasses. So your plants that are dying back in the winter, coming back either from a seed bank that is persistent in an area, or for perennial plants that have root systems underground that allow them to come back each year. And for this, very similar to the woody species in terms of identifying characteristics, we were looking at roots, stems, forms, leaves, flowers, and fruit. So for roots, if it is a perennial species that allows it to come back each winter from the rootstock, some of these species will have a long carrot-like taproot. So this is a picture of Queen Anne's lace, which is an invasive species that we track, although it is very common around New York State. Other species that we track, things like wild parsnip or giant hogweed, common mullein, species that will have, kind of that long carrot-like main taproot, as well as some finer roots near the surface. Species like swallowwort will have more of a root ball, kind of this cluster of larger roots close to the surface. In this photo, you can kind of see some of the buds on this as well. So if you were to rip the plant out and leave the root ball, would be able to send up a new plant from one of these buds. And then species like mugwort or knotweed are what we call rhizomatous root systems. So this is mugwort growing along a paved area with kind of a crack in the middle of the pavement there. And you can see that it kind of fills in all of the available space there. And what rhizomatous roots allow species to do is reproduce from a single root fragment. So if you were to try to dig this up and you left a one inch long root fragment left in the soil, that would be enough for it to sprout up a new plant from that. Also makes it very easily spread if you are, moving contaminated fill from one area to another. Any of that rootstock is enough for it to start a new population. So stems, a few examples here of some unique stem species, something like wild parsnip, a single color, that bright green color, a little bit of ridging to it, no visible hairs, and you can compare it to a similar species taxonomically, giant hogweed, where it will have those ridged structures as well, but it will also have kind of this purple mottling to it, purple splotches, as well as this visible hairs, especially along the node here where it sort of branches off. So things like coloration, shape, absence or presence of hairs is good. For a species like purple loosestrife, if you were to take a species like that and kind of roll it between your fingers, you'll feel that it has a very distinctly square stem. So for something like this, if it doesn't have flowers on it that could be used for identification, you could cut the stem and show the cross section to kind of have that perfectly square shape to it, and that's a good feature for identification. Form. So there are a lot of species that kind of have a two-form life cycle to them, in the form of having a rosette and then a fruiting, like a mature structure. So things like teasels, mullein, and thistle, bull thistle specifically, they will have one or several years where they're in this short little rosette form. They'll basically just kind of put out a, plate-shaped array of leaves to build up energy. So over the years, they'll be kind of building up energy in that large taproot that I mentioned earlier. And then once they have enough stored where they can produce their flowers and fruits, they'll send up this much larger fruiting structure. So while a mullein might be, 6 inches across and small in the beginning, after it has enough energy, it will send up this large spike, which can be 6 to 8 feet tall and covered in these yellow flowers at the top. Same thing for bull thistle and teasel. There's a few other species that do it as well. Again, leaves are a good identifying feature. A few examples here. Wild parsnip kind of has this compound leaf with these many small leaflets along it. Mugwort has a more solid leaf. Another example of one that has a distinct silvery underside to it. So this is a good one to flip over. At least one of the leaves in the photo so that you can see both sides of it. Garlic mustard, this is another one of those species that has a rosette form and then a larger form. This is it in the rosette, where it just has these kind of small circular shaped leaves with an end cut near the stem. and then a little bit of serration. Flowers, again, for herbaceous species, there are tons of different varieties of flowers, and they're a really good identifying feature. Sometimes they are unique enough on their own that you can be able to tell the species. Sometimes there are native species that look very similar to it. So for something like lesser celandine, you can see this here has these sepals at the bottom of the flowering structure. That's really good for differentiating it from something like marsh marigold, which is a similar looking flower that comes out at a similar time in the year, very early in the spring. So this is a good identifying feature if you can kind of take an underneath picture or capturing it when it isn't fully open. The multiple swallowwort species, a pale and black swallowwort, very hard to tell apart unless it's currently in flower. And then one of my favorite fun facts for invasive species is with knotweed. So many people are very aware of Japanese knotweed and how common it is. But if you ever go and look at the flowers very closely, this is an example of Bohemian knotweed, which is a hybrid between Japanese knotweed and giant knotweed. And you can see protruding from the end of the flowers are the male parts, the stamens. And that lets you know that it is a Bohemian knotweed because all Japanese knotweed flowers are female. So you'll never see these stamen protruding from the end. So if you're out in the field this summer and you come across any flowering knotweed, I encourage you to take a closer look at it and see what species it actually is. This is a species that is very underreported because most people see it and immediately recognize it as Japanese knotweed. That's how it's been reported for a very long time. So the abundance of this is probably a lot greater than is actually reported. And then fruit, again, great diversity in that. Things like garlic mustard have these long seed pods with hard black seed that kind of falls down to the ground and creates that seed bank. Several species will have these wind-carried seeds that once the pods mature and open up, there'll be kind of a feathery, downy substance that will carry the seed on a breeze. So things like thistle and swallowwort will have things like that. Winged seeds, so things like knotweed will have these papery wings that help to carry seeds to new locations. And then again, there's a wide array of colors and shapes and structures. So something like myelominate might have a very striking blue color to the fruit. So if it's late in the season and you can't see the leaves as well, the fruit is a good indicator. All right, so that is all of the plant species that we're going to go through. And now we're going to jump into aquatic plants. So the main thing that we want to highlight for taking photos of aquatic plants is that there's a big difference between taking a photo of a plant in water versus taking a photo of a plant in water. So the picture on the left and the picture on the right were both reported to iMapInvasives as Eurasian water milfoil. Only one of them gets confirmed though, because you can only actually see one of them. And I'm fully convinced that there is a large population of milfoil right under the surface here, but the problem is you can't see any of it. Lighting becomes a lot more challenging when you're trying to take a photo in water. Obviously, if you have a very still day with no ripples on the surface of the water and it's cloudy, you've got a mirror effect, and you're basically just taking a picture of the sky when you're trying to photograph the water. So the best thing that we often suggest people do if you're trying to photograph an invasive aquatic plant is to take a small section of it out of the water and put it into like a clear Tupperware container or a small container of water where you can get a more clear photo of it. So even in this one here, you can see there's a little bit of glare over on the left side that makes it a little bit cloudy, but it's a lot better than the photo on the left side there. Object for scale is also really important for aquatic plants. A lot of times there are similar species where the best way to tell them apart is how large certain structures are. So they did pretty well with their ruler right here in the corner. You can also do something like drop a quarter into the water. Having your object for scale in the water with the species is really good because, again, water can kind of distort things, make them look larger or longer than they actually are. So having something in there for scale is always really good. Another reason why having them in water while you're trying to photograph them is many plants tend to kind of flop over and melt. So again, this is two pictures of your Eurasian water milfoil. The one on the left looks more similar to like a pile of cooked spinach. You can't really see any of the distinct identifying features on it, whilst the one on the right there is a lot more easy to see all the different features. There are certain species where when you pull them out of water, they do kind of retain their shape and they have a more rigid structure to them, and that is important to include. So you can either have a photo of that or include it in the comment section for a record. But in general, a lot of the invasive plants do better for photographing when you have them in water. And then a few more just general tips for things like the milfoils, Elodia, hydrilla, things like that. A lot of times they'll have this kind of whorled structure. So there'll be these individual whorls of leaves coming out of one section, and then there'll be several whorls as they make their way up the stem. So what you can do is just take like a small cutting of it and just cut out like one of those whorls so you can lay it flat. Or in a photograph like this is pretty good because you can see how many leaves are branching out from a single whorl. So I can see there's 4 here. I can see each leaflet pretty clearly. I can see the ends of the leaves are kind of flattened. And all of this lets me know that, yes, this is going to be Eurasian water milfoil. And then again, things like the margins of the leaves can be important for down here, like with the curly leaf pondweed. Again, seeing that lasagna structure, kind of the curly leaf of it, is good for identification. For aquatic plants, timing is also very important. Again, we'll use the example of the curly pondweed here. This is a species that kind of starts to leaf out and grow while there's still ice over many water bodies. And then by midsummer, by the end of July, you're really not going to find much of it because it's already broken down for the season. It's already fully lived out its life cycle and it's gone dormant again. So knowing when certain species are out can be very important. And species in water also tend to break down a little more quickly. So in this one, again, you can see stipules, if you remember stipules from the multiflora rose example I gave earlier. A good way to tell apart a lot of the pondweed species is by how this stipule looks. And this is one that breaks down very fast in water. It could be kind of free floating, it could be clasped around the stem, but the constant movement of water can kind of break them down a little faster. So if you're towards the tail end of the season, you might say, oh, there's no stipule present, so it might be this species, when in reality, it may have just kind of worn away by that point. So that's it for aquatic species. And then the final section of species that we're going to get into is critters. So that's, your aquatic insects, terrestrial insects, fish, anything that crawls around and doesn't behave very well for photographing. So one of the most important things is to research what you might be looking for, looking at current distributions of where certain species are, where species could be or where they could not be. If you are looking for Asian shore crab, you're probably going to want to look for it in a saltwater environment instead of in the Great Lakes area. Or if you see a crab in one of these places, you can rule out saltwater species. If you're looking for a specific species, it's very good to know if there are any lookalikes. So for the example of Asian longhorn beetle, at iMap we get reports every year of the white-spotted sawyer. It looks very similar. It has sort of that similar dark black color to it, the long horns. It is another longhorn beetle, but it will have a very distinct white spot right behind its head, which lets us know that it is not an Asian longhorn beetle and it's this white-spotted sawyer. If it doesn't have that, that doesn't necessarily mean it is an ALB, but it means it's not this lookalike. So familiarizing yourself with lookalike species is good, so you know what to look for. And then determining if it's even feasible or possible for you to identify a certain species. So this is an example of a few species of shrimp. The one in the middle here, Macrodactylus, this is an invasive species that we track. It is one that is documented to be down in the lower Hudson estuary area, but we don't have any reports for it in iMap because the way you actually identify it is by looking at it under a microscope to count the ridges it has along its rostrum. So this is the eye of a shrimp. The shrimp is like an inch long. We're talking, fractions of millimeters. This entire structure is like 1 or 2 millimeters long. So if you want to report this to iMap, you need to have a pretty powerful camera, or you need to um, just know that it's not really feasible to look for. So knowing to pick your battles for certain species. Other general tips for photographing different critters. Taking as many photos as possible is usually a pretty good rule of thumb, and from as many angles as possible as well. So top down, from the front, the sides, the underneath, the bottom of it, highlighting any distinct characteristics that are distinct to that type of species. So if you're looking at like a crayfish, looking at its claws, its legs, the way its shell kind of comes together. For insects, looking at the wings or the antenna. Scale is very important for these things as well. A lot of times they can look very similar to other similar species, and size again is a good indicator. Also having something nearby. Oftentimes for creatures, the best way to have them cooperate for a photo is to, kind of capture them in something, or to kill them first to make sure that they don't fly away while you're trying to take a photo of it, especially if it's a high priority species. And then making sure that if it is a species that has a specific host, making sure that the host plant is also identifiable. So down here, starting from the lower left, balsam woolly adelgid, we do know this is a species that grows on the bark of balsam fir trees, and we can tell this is a balsam fir because there are a few of these resin blisters. Or red pine scale, we know it grows in the branches, so that checks out. And then we can also see these little cluster of two long needles, so we know it's red pine. For this crayfish species, it's a really good photo, all things considered. It's very close up, it's very clear, you can see a lot. There's enough here for us to tell that it's not one of the invasives, but there isn't enough for us to tell whether or not or what specific native species it actually is. For that, you would need to get into, like, the interior claw, how many bumps are along it. There's a lot of like very small nuances for some of these species. For crayfish in general, one of the best things to highlight is the back. This area, there's kind of these two halves of the carapace that are coming together. The area between them is called the areola. And in native species, you'll be able to see this kind of run throughout the midsection of the crayfish here. And in the invasive ones, it will kind of come together and the two halves will touch. And then over on the right side here, this is my favorite photo of brown goby that has ever come to iMap because it's the only one I've ever seen that encompasses both of the most distinct characteristics for the species, which is the black dot on the back of the dorsal fin, as well as the fused pelvic fin that kind of forms this almost suction cup-like structure. Oftentimes, one is enough, if you can just get the black spot or just the fused fin, but this one has both, which is great. And then a final note for photographing different creatures. If you are using signs and symptoms that, evidence that something has been there or has been feeding on a host species, you really want to include as many photos and as much evidence as possible, especially if this is in a new area, like a new county where emerald ash borer has not been reported before. If you send a photo of just one D-shaped exit hole, that will not be enough information for the DEC to confirm that it's present in that area. But if you're able to take, 4 or 5 pictures of these very distinct D-shaped holes, as well as peel back the bark on a tree and show these S-shaped galleries, that might be enough evidence for them to confirm it. So taking multiple photos of the same signs, so, multiple galleries, multiple exit holes. If you're looking for elm zigzag sawfly and you see several leaves that have feeding damage on it, the more you can collect, the better the record will stand to be confirmed. And then some final takeaway messages. Timing when to do your surveys can be really important. Knowing what species you're looking for and when is the best time to look at them, when those identifying features are actually going to be present, and when the species is actually going to be present. Taking multiple photos, getting different angles, encompassing multiple identifying features, being close up, sharp, in focus, good lighting, and knowing that not all features are created equally, and sometimes there is a little bit of unreliability or subjectivity to some of them. Good example of that is like the honeysuckle. Like I said, there's a lot of hybridization between them. So something like the color of a flower or the color of a fruit on the honeysuckle bush might not always be a 100% indicator of what species it actually is. Using the comments box. So whenever you report a species to iMapInvasives, no matter what tool you're using or what method, there is an area for you to write additional information in a comments box. This is a really good place, if you're taking a photo of a single individual in a large population, that's where you can say, there's a monoculture that's a half acre large. You can kind of give more idea of what the site really looks like. And you can also specifically mention what identifying features you used to come to the conclusion of which species you reported it as. Everyone in the iMap team is really great for knowing these different invasive species, but we do track over 600 of them, so remembering which features are identifying at the drop of a hat can be difficult sometimes. So if you're able to say, hey, I know this is a round goby because it has the suction cup on the bottom and the black spot, it makes our job a little bit easier as well. And the biggest all-encompassing thing is doing the best you can. Obviously, it's not always going to be the best conditions. The lighting will not always be perfect. Your plant will not always be in flower. Your bug is not going to stand still for a photo opportunity. But we ask that you just, capture as much as you are able to, and report it as what you believe the species to be. There is no penalty for being wrong. The worst thing that happens is we'll delete the record and reach out to you and say, hey, this wasn't actually what you thought it was. If you have a bunch of pictures of a species and you're completely unsure as what to report it as, you can also reach out to us directly. Just send us an email with those photos attached and say, hey, I found this. I don't know what it is. I think it might be an invasive. We can take a closer look at it. If you are looking for more specific species identification resources to learn more about the species that might be common in your area, we do have a page dedicated for these resources, newyorkimapinvasives.org/resources. We have training modules, different videos, identification guides. We have links to the different PRISM websites. All of these PRISMs will have specific species profiles for some of the most common species within that region. Again, if you're looking for any sort of specific resources and you're having difficulty finding them, you can reach out to us directly and we can help you find what you're looking for. And with that, I want to say thank you very much, everyone, for joining for today's webinar.